Provosts don't always get a round of applause, so I'll take it. Thank you. So, good evening and welcome. I'm Carl Lejwe. I have the privilege of being the provost here at Stony Brook University, and I am pleased to be here with you to show our gratitude to Sarah Baxter, the Colvin Center Director, and to Dean Stephanie Kelton for hosting this truly amazing talk today and reminding us of the importance of a free press and the courageous, dedicated journalists whose work help us and the rest of the world try to understand the world around us. Conversations like tonight have always been important, and they remain incredibly so today. Our world is full of opinions that masquerade as facts, lies masquerading as truth, and it's never been more difficult to tell one from the other. Journalists and journalism, with their clear commitment to ethics and doing the hard work of verification, are an important, in fact, a crucial piece of the global, unending effort to distill truth from fiction and lies from reality. As a leading university, it's Stony Brook's responsibility and our honor to host these conversations. Thank you, Sarah, for organizing tonight's event. And thanks to the Colvin Center for everything it has been for this university. This series is one of my favorites because it features journalists who constantly embody Marie Colvin's courage and conviction to speak truth to power. Tonight's speaker, Vladimir Kara-Murza, is no exception. Vladimir is a Russian politician, author, historian, and documentary filmmaker. He's one of the most distinguished Russian opponents of Vladimir Putin today. From his convictions, he's been poisoned twice and imprisoned for 2 years, including 11 months in solitary confinement in Siberia. A contributing writer to the Washington Post, he's won a Pulitzer Prize for his columns from prison. He's directed 3 documentary films, written or contributed to several books about Russian history and politics, and lectured at universities around the world. Today, we are delighted to welcome him here. Vladimir, thank you for being here and sharing some of your story and your truly important for us to hear experiences. So with that, I have the pleasure of bringing up our interim dean for the School of Communication and Journalism, Dr. Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie, please come up.
Thank you very much, Provost Lejwe, for those inspiring remarks and for your continued support of the School of Communication and Journalism. And good evening, everyone. It's an honor to welcome you here tonight to the 13th annual Marie Colvin Distinguished Lecture, one of the most meaningful events in our academic calendar. My name is Stephanie Kelton. As Carl said, I'm the interim dean for the School of Communication and Journalism. The Colvin Center embodies the spirit of Marie Colvin, a woman who believed that bearing witness to the truth was a professional responsibility as well as a moral obligation. Marie's conviction cost her her life. And yet, the journalists we celebrate through this lecture series remind us that even knowing the risks, there are those who remain committed to the pursuit of truth and who are willing to sacrifice everything to hold power to account. Marie would no doubt be delighted to hear from tonight's speaker. Our guest this evening knows those costs in the most personal terms imaginable. He's faced them, endured them, and refused to allow them to silence him. He's lived the courage of his conviction, and he is exactly the kind of journalist that this distinguished lecture series was created to honor. I want to thank Sarah Baxter, the entire Colvin Center team. These are not small events to put on. A lot of work goes on behind the scenes for a long period of time before we get to this point. So thank all of you for the hard work that you did to make tonight's event possible. And I want to thank all of you in the audience, again, for being here with us tonight. It is itself an act of solidarity with the journalists around the world who cannot speak freely, and it's a symbol of our appreciation for the vital work that they do. And now it's my privilege to hand things over to Sarah Baxter, the director of the Marie Colvin Center, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Dean Kelton. It is wonderful to see so many people here. Thank you for coming. Now, 14 years ago, the legendary foreign correspondent Marie Colvin lost her life in Syria, and we miss her every day. We are proud to have her sister, Kat Colvin, here with us. Welcome, Kat. We're so grateful for everything you do to support Marie's legacy. And I just want to pause here briefly. I know you will come to hear Vladimir Kara-Murza, and he'll be here in a sec. But I want to pay tribute to Marie Colvin's brother-in-arms, the photographer Paul Conroy. We lost one of the bravest and the best when he died just over a week ago. Paul was with Marie when she was killed in Syria, and he was seriously wounded at the same time. He was devoted to Marie, and he made a brilliant documentary about their last days in Syria together called Under the Wire, which I strongly recommend. He was funny and charming as well as brave. Best of all, as far as bragging rights were concerned, he was thrilled to be played by Jamie Dornan of 50 Shades of Grey fame in the Hollywood movie about Marie's life of private war. Paul spent the last 4 years on the front lines in Ukraine and was packing for the Middle East to report on what he called the apocalypse when he suffered a heart attack. He was just 61. Far more than most people, Paul knew why it mattered to take risks on behalf of the truth. He would have recognized a kindred spirit in Vladimir Kara-Murza, a champion of truth and freedom in an era of lies and disinformation. Vladimir, we are honored to have you as the 2026 Distinguished Marie Colvin Lecturer. Please welcome the Pulitzer Prize winning politician and journalist, Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you. There will be questions at the end.
Sarah, thank you so much for the kind words of introduction. Provost, Dean, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for welcoming me to this beautiful university and this beautiful theater. I feel privileged, delighted, and very happy to be with you tonight, and it is a special honor to be delivering this year's Marie Colvin Lecture, an enduring tribute to a courageous journalist who lived her life and who gave her life in the pursuit of truth. There's nothing dictatorships hate more than truth. And the first targets in their quest for absolute power are usually, almost always, independent media voices. After seizing power in Russia in a coup d'etat in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks issued a decree on the press, essentially outlawing any newspaper that disagreed with them. On the basis of this decree, between October 1917 and June of 1918, more than 470 opposition-minded newspapers were shut down all over Russia. One of the first actions of Adolf Hitler's government in Germany in 1933 was to take over and close down all independent publications, initially using the emergency powers under the Enabling Act in March of 1933, and eventually cementing state censorship with the so-called Editor's Law in October. After their own military coup in 1973, the Chilean military junta, led by General Augusto Pinochet, shut down or censored all opposition newspapers. And the endless list goes on. Testimony to the fact that a necessary precondition for authoritarian rule is shutting off citizens' access to objective information. Testimony to the fact that dictatorship is incompatible with truth. In choosing his first target after coming to power in Russia 26 years ago, Vladimir Putin followed the well-traveled path. In one of his first interviews as interim president of Russia, this was at the beginning of the year 2000, Putin said a phrase that sort of puzzled a lot of people. People started asking, what does he mean by that? Why is he saying this? He said, «Кто нас обидит, 3 дней не проживет». Those who will offend us will not survive 3 days. Well, it turned out he meant it almost literally. Because on day 4 of his inauguration as president of Russia, on the 11th of May of 2000, Putin sent armed operatives from the FSB, the Prosecutor General Service, and the Federal Tax Police to raid the offices of Media Most, at that time Russia's largest private media holding and the parent company of NTV, the country's most watched, most successful independent television network. Founded in 1993, during Russia's brief period of democracy, NTV had become synonymous with high-quality professional journalism. It was known for the fierce independence of its news coverage and its editorial policy. It was NTV, for example, that had brought the uncensored, horrific reality of the first war in Chechnya in the mid-1990s to millions of households around Russia. And the channel never shied away from criticizing the government, exposing corruption in the highest tiers of the Kremlin administration. And it never shied away from criticizing the president personally. And this did not change when President Yeltsin resigned, leaving Vladimir Putin in charge of the Kremlin and of the country. In early 2000, in January, in the midst of the presidential election campaign, NTV aired an episode of its flagship satirical program called Kukly, Puppets. It's a program where politicians would be represented by puppets acting out as literary characters from some sort of a novel, a work of fiction. You may have heard of a similar program on British television in the 1980s called Spitting Image. It was exactly the same principle. And that particular episode of Kukly in January of 2000 was based on Little Zaches, a 19th century German novel by Ernst Hoffmann, where the main character was a mean and ugly dwarf who, thanks to a magic spell from a fairy, suddenly became worshipped and admired by everyone around him. People started seeing him as handsome, talented, intelligent, whereas in reality, he was just a mean and ugly dwarf. You can probably guess who was portrayed as the ugly dwarf in that episode. Vladimir Putin was furious. The same evening this episode aired, he was reported to have told his wife that, and I quote, "Gusinsky is finished," referring to Vladimir Gusinsky, the owner and majority shareholder of NTV and Media Most. And just 2 days before the election in March, NTV drew more of the Kremlin's ire when its popular investigative show publicly raised the possibility that the series of mysterious terrorist explosions in residential apartment buildings across Russia in September of 1999 that were blamed by the government on quote-unquote Chechen terrorists and that had given Putin the pretext to launch his second war in Chechnya had in fact been organized by the Russian security services. That same summer, in the summer of 2000, Vladimir Gusinsky was briefly arrested and placed in Moscow's notorious Butyrka prison and then forced to leave the country. In April of 2001, after a series of orchestrated court rulings and a rigged shareholder meeting, the studios of NTV on the 8th floor of Moscow's Ostankino television center were forcibly taken over by security guards from the Russian state-owned energy company Gazprom that now claimed control of the channel and of its editorial policy. It would take another 2 years for Vladimir Putin to destroy independent television in Russia completely. After this forcible takeover of NTV, its leading journalists went to TV6, a smaller private television network that was mostly known for its light entertainment shows. The journalists took much of the NTV old audience with them, and within weeks of their arrival, TV6 became the most trusted name in news on Russian television and skyrocketed in viewer ratings. Now, needless to say, this did not conform with the Kremlin's plans. In January of 2002, Russia's higher arbitration court ruled in favor of a minority shareholder of TV6, a state-connection pension fund, that was demanding the network's closure under an obscure financial regulation that had been repealed the previous year. These pseudo-legal shenanigans could not fool anyone. It was clear that the Kremlin was behind the destruction of the channel. That same month, as a result of that judicial order, TV6 had its license revoked and its broadcasting signal shut off from the air. The journalists made one last attempt, and in the summer of 2002, they returned on the air under the brand of TVS, a channel that was co-owned in equal shares by some of Russia's biggest business leaders. The absence of one controlling shareholder was intended to ensure editorial independence, but in reality resulted in constant conflicts between the co-owners that were also skillfully played against each other by the Kremlin and in a chronic underfunding. Shortly after midnight, on June 22, 2003, TVS was switched off the air by the order of Vladimir Putin's press minister, Mikhail Lesin, who explained his move, and I quote, that he was acting in the interests of the viewers, end of quote. By this stage, the Kremlin was evidently no longer concerned with judicial theatrics. With the closure of TVS, Russia's last nationwide independent television networks, the government had reestablished its Soviet-era monopoly on the largest source of information for millions of our citizens. The story of Russian media since then has been a story of a non-stop tightening of the screws, with the number of news outlets that are independent of the government shrinking and shrinking with each coming year. The remaining pockets of uncensored media in Russia were destroyed at the end of February and the beginning of March of 2022, when Vladimir Putin launched his unprovoked and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Within days of the invasion, Russia's so-called parliament rubber-stamped a package of laws, making it a criminal offense not only to oppose the war, but to even present honest facts about it. In the eyes of the Russian state, there was no war in Ukraine. There were no deliberate bombings of schools, hospitals, of maternity wards. There were no mass civilian casualties. And anyone who said anything to the contrary was now a criminal. The key piece of evidence, if I may be allowed to use that word, in the criminal case against me was this one-page document, a letter from Lieutenant General Igor Dilevsky, Deputy Chief of the Main Operational Directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. It was dated the 19th of May, 2022, and addressed to the Investigative Committee. To this day, my blood boils when I look at it. I quote, "The Russian Federation is not conducting a war against Ukraine. The civilian population of Ukraine has not been and is not a target of attacks for servicemen of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Any acts of violence or threats of violence against such people are not permitted." End of quote. George Orwell could not have known how faithfully his dystopian reality would be recreated in Vladimir Putin's Russia. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The same week those laws were adopted, Russia's remaining major independent media outlets, including Echo of Moscow Radio, TV Rain, and Novaya Gazeta newspaper, were closed down by the government, and at the same time as well, the Russian government imposed a blanket, total Chinese-style blockade of the internet, shutting off Russian citizens' access to social media and independent media outlets that continued to operate from abroad. This year marks the 26th anniversary of Vladimir Putin's coming to power. 26 years since he began his war on truth. And when I use the word war, this is not just a figure of speech, because the casualties of this war include not only independent media outlets or opposition political parties, but also very real human lives. In the summer of 2003, that same summer, Putin's government pulled the plug on Russia's last independent nationwide television network. Yuri Shekachyhin fell ill with a strange ailment. Shekachyhin was one of Russia's most prominent investigative journalist. He worked at Novaya Gazeta and specialized in exposing high-level government corruption. He was also a member of the Russian parliament for the opposition Yabloko party. That summer, he was investigating corruption at the top tiers of the FSB, the main domestic security service, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. And he was scheduled to travel to Washington to meet with the FBI to discuss this matter. Shortly before he was due to fly, he felt unwell. His mysterious 16-day illness saw him lose almost all of his skin and hair and go into a multiple organ failure. It was a terrible death, recalls Dmitry Muratov, editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. In 2 weeks, someone who was only a little over 50 turned into a deeply aged old man. End of quote. The Russian authorities announced the official cause of Yuri Shekachychin's death as Lyell's syndrome. I had to look up what that was. It is a severe and extremely rare allergic reaction that affects one person in a million. Now, of course, Shekachychin's colleagues at Novaya Gazeta had absolutely no doubt that he was deliberately poisoned. Yuri Shekachychin was one of 6 journalists from Novaya Gazeta, only one publication, who were murdered since Vladimir Putin came to power. Another was Anna Politkovskaya. A crusading investigative journalist, she exposed horrific war crimes committed by the Russian army in Chechnya, both during the First War in the mid-1990s and in the Second War that began in 1999 and had served as Putin's launchpad into the Kremlin. On the 7th of October 2006, Vladimir Putin's birthday, Anna Politkovskaya was gunned down in the entrance of her apartment building in Moscow as she was returning home after shopping. The immediate perpetrators in her assassination were convicted and sent to prison. The organizers and, needless to say, the mastermind remain fully protected from the highest levels of the Russian state, a pattern we see consistently in political assassinations in Vladimir Putin's Russia. The same was the case in the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. Deputy Prime Minister of Russia under President Yeltsin in the 1990s, Nemtsov emerged as the most prominent, the most visible, the most effective political opponent of Vladimir Putin's dictatorship. He organized mass protests against election fraud and against Putin's war in Ukraine, the first one that started in 2014. He advocated for international sanctions against Putin's close entourage under the Magnitsky Act and led hard-hitting and high-profile investigations into government corruption. Boris Nemtsov could not be bought. He could not be scared. He could not be compelled to leave the country. And so the evening of February 27, 2015, he was silenced the only way he could be, by 5 bullets in his back as he walked home across a bridge, literally in front of the Kremlin. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that Boris Nemtsov's right to life under Article 2 of the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms had been violated by the Russian state. An oversight report published in 2020 by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe contained witness testimony pointing to where and when Vladimir Putin and head of his personal security service, General Viktor Zolotov, gave the order to Ramzan Kadyrov, the Kremlin-appointed ruler in Chechnya, to kill Boris Nemtsov. Last month marked 11 years since his murder. Last month also marked 2 years since the murder of Alexei Navalny, a prominent anti-corruption campaigner and another leading Kremlin opponent, who was poisoned to death in his prison cell in an Arctic penal colony in February of 2024. 3 weeks ago, during this year's Munich Security Conference, 5 countries, including Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, issued a joint statement based on laboratory analysis of Navalny's post-mortem biological samples, confirming that Alexei Navalny had been poisoned by epibatidine, a neurotoxin found in the skin of Ecuadorian dart frogs. It is important to remember that when we are speaking about Vladimir Putin, we are speaking not only about a dictator, We're speaking not only about an illegitimate usurper, he is all of those things, but we're also speaking about a murderer in the most direct and most literal sense of this word. At the beginning of my remarks, I said that I felt very happy to be here with you tonight. And believe me, this was not just a polite figure of speech. Twice in May of 2015 and again in February of 2017, I was myself poisoned, went into a coma, and suffered multiple organ failure. Official diagnosis given to me at the Moscow hospital read, and I quote, "toxic action by an undefined substance," end of quote. And both times, doctors told my wife that I had a 5% chance to live. In February of 2021, a groundbreaking media investigation led by the London-based outlet Bellingcat identified by name 4 officers of the FSB, the Russian Federal Security Services, who secretly followed me on my trips around Russian regions, a total of 14 overlapping trips to 7 different destinations between February of 2015 and December of 2016, before both of the poisonings. These were members of the same FSB death squad who had been tailing Boris Nemtsov in the months leading up to his assassination in February of 2015, and who had been following Alexei Navalny before his first poisoning in August of 2020. This is the reality of today's Russia. There's a special government unit whose job it is to follow and physically eliminate political opponents of Vladimir Putin's government. After I survived the poisonings, the Kremlin tried a more traditional method. In April of 2022, about 6 weeks into Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I was arrested near my home in Moscow. 1 year later, after a speedy closed-door trial at the Moscow City Court, I was given a 25-year sentence for the 5 public speeches I had made, criticizing Putin, criticizing the war in Ukraine, criticizing political repression in Russia. On the day of my sentencing, as I was being escorted down from the courtroom into the basement cells of the Moscow City Court where the prisoners are held, the commanding officer of the police convoy turned to me and said, "Did you really just get 25 years for 5 speeches?" I said, "Yeah, I guess I did." He thought for a second and said, "Well, at least I hope they were good." 19 months ago, I was sitting in solitary confinement at a maximum security prison in Siberia, certain that this was what the rest of my life was going to look like. I'll be honest, I did not believe I would get out of that prison alive. The prisoner exchange on the 1st of August 2024 that freed 16 of us from the hell of Vladimir Putin's modern-day gulag was a miracle. This is the only way I can still describe it to this day. But it was in many ways a human-made miracle, made possible by the relentless efforts of good people in democratic nations who never stopped speaking out, advocating, shouting on behalf of all of those people in Russia who have been imprisoned for the only quote-unquote crime of standing up to Putin's dictatorship and of calling out his murderous war in Ukraine. The preparations for that exchange were kept secret until the very last moment. Just like all the other Russian prisoners, I had no idea that something was even happening. To me, this whole story began in the last week of July of 2024. I was sitting in my cell at my prison in Omsk, this is southwestern Siberia, alone as always. This has been a long tradition in our country going back to Soviet times that those political prisoners whom the regime considers to be quote-unquote particularly dangerous are always kept in solitary confinement, always isolated, always alone. So I was just sitting in my cell, walking around in these small circles, just buried in my thoughts and memories, when suddenly the doors of the cell were open and a security officer walked in with a prison guard. And he took me out of the cell and escorted me to some sort of a prison office, a small room. There was a desk, a chair, a big portrait of Vladimir Putin on the wall. And on the desk, there was a blank piece of paper with a pen and some sort of a pre-printed template next to it. So the security officer tells me to sit down, take the pen, and write with my own hand whatever's written on the template. So I look at it, and it was a request for pardon addressed to Vladimir Putin, in which I was supposed to admit my guilt, express my profound remorse for all the crimes I had supposedly committed, and ask Mr. Putin to please pardon me. When I saw the paper initially, I thought this was a prank, so I just started laughing, and I looked at the security officer, but his facial expression did not indicate that he was in the mood for a joke. So I said, "What is this?" He said, "Please sit down and write this with your own hand." I said, "I'm not signing anything like this ever." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, first of all, because I have no guilt to admit. I'm not the criminal here. The criminals are those people in the Kremlin who are waging this war, not those of us who are in prisons because we had opposed it. And secondly, because I do not consider Vladimir Putin to be a legitimate president of my country. He's a dictator, he is a usurper, he's a murderer, and I'm not going to ask him of anything." The security officer was visibly displeased with my response, and he asked if I would put that on paper, and I said, "That I'm very happy to put on paper." So I took the pen, and I wrote what I just said to you, adding there at the end that I very much hope to live to see the day when Mr. Putin is put on trial for all the crimes he had committed. Signed it, dated it, gave it to the officer. They took me back to the cell, locked the door. I had no idea where this came from, what this meant, and what was the purpose of all of this. About 3 or 4 days later, I was fast asleep. It was the middle of the night. It was dark. There was no clock or watch in the cell. Prisoners are not allowed one. We're always supposed to feel disoriented, but this was the middle of the night. It was dark. I was sleeping when I was suddenly woken up by a loud screeching noise as the 2 metal doors of my cell were burst open, and the same security officer barged in with a few prison guards around him. And he said to me, "Convict Kara-Murza, you have 10 minutes to get up, get dressed, and get ready." And at that moment, I was sure they're going to lead me to the nearby forest and shoot me. But instead, they took me to the airport, the normal civilian airport. Omsk is a large city, more than 1 million people. And I kind of described what it felt like, after permanent solitary confinement, to suddenly find myself in the middle of a civilian airport with shops and cafes and advertising and people and families with children. Of course, I was in handcuffs and 6 police escort officers around me. They put me on a plane and flew me to Moscow. Very quick, easy, and pleasant 3-hour flight. When I was taken from Moscow to Siberia the previous year, the journey took 3 weeks, and it was in exact same way that prisoners in Russia had been transported for decades and decades. What we read about in books by Alexander Solzhenitsyn and similar authors. The Stolypin wagons, the famous Russian prison trains with stops in transit prisons along the way. It took me 3 weeks to get from Moscow to Siberia. A very quick and easy 3-hour flight back. From the airport in Moscow, they took me here, another name we read about in Solzhenitsyn's books and Bukovsky's books and books by other heroes of Russia's anti-Soviet resistance, the notorious KGB political prison in Moscow that once held legendary Kremlin opponents, the likes of Alexander Solzhenitsyn himself and Natan Sharansky and Vladimir Bukovsky and so many others, and locked me up again in a solitary confinement cell without so much as a word of explanation. I had no idea what was going on. Of course, by now I'm not thinking they're going to kill me. What's the point of flying me to Moscow for that? I'm thinking it's going to be a new criminal case, because normally the only reason they would bring somebody who's already convicted and serving time elsewhere in a penal colony back to Lefortovo is to indict that person on new criminal charges. Now, I sort of thought, what's the point of adding new charges to somebody who already has a 25-year sentence, essentially life? But that system does not always function according to normal human logic. So day went after day, and finally came the morning of August 1st. That morning, the deputy director of the Lefortovo prison, a lieutenant colonel in the FSB, walked into my cell with prison guards who were carrying bags with all my stuff that I brought from Siberia, that they brought from storage. They put the bags down, and the deputy director tells me to get out of my prison uniform and put on whatever civilian clothes I had on me. And the only civilian clothes I had on me was my black T-shirt in which I slept, my long johns, because in Siberia it's -40 in the winter, you have to really put something underneath when you go outside, and the rubber flip-flops that I would use to go to the prison shower. So I put this on. The deputy director was not very happy. He asked me, "Don't you have any normal civilian clothes?" And I said, "Lieutenant Colonel, I'm serving a 25-year sentence in solitary confinement at a maximum security prison in Siberia. Why would I need civilian clothes?" He had nothing to respond to that, just waved me out. And just to show you how endless and surreal that day was for me, that same evening, I'll be meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, wearing that same T-shirt, the same long johns, and the rubber flip-flops from the prison shower. They escorted me down into the courtyard of Lefortovo, and there was a long row of men, plain clothes, but their faces covered with black balaclava masks. And I have to say, I've seen a lot of things in my time in prison, but it was still a fairly intimidating sight. These were members of the Alpha Group, the FSB Spetsnaz, the elite FSB Special Operations Team. And next to them was some kind of a bus, not a prison bus, a regular, normal, ordinary passenger bus, and I was told to get up on it, and I did. And inside I saw more men in black balaclava masks, more officers of the FSB Alpha Group. But next to each of them, I suddenly saw a friend, a colleague, a fellow political prisoner who'd been serving time in penal colonies all across Russia. And it was at that moment that I finally understood. Because there could only be one reason why all of us would be sitting on that bus together. It's a fairly quick ride to Vnukovo 2, the government airport in the southwest of Moscow. About a 3-hour flight. They didn't tell us where we were flying, but we could see by the sun. It was to the south. And so we were flown to Ankara, the international airport of the Turkish capital, where all the planes, as well as the planes who brought the people Putin was getting back as part of the exchange from Western countries, were all taxied off to some sort of a military wing of the airport. There was a security perimeter by the Turkish armed forces. And the exchange itself took maybe 30 or 40 minutes when they verified the identities of all the prisoners, and then the people Putin was getting back walked up on our plane, and we were put on a bus that sped away and took us to some sort of a government terminal, a big reception area at Ankara Airport. And we walked in there feeling totally disoriented, totally surreal. You know, just that morning I was certain I was going to die in a Russian prison. Here I was in a government reception in a Turkish airport. And just when I thought things could not get any more crazy, a lady walked up to me. She was wearing a business suit and holding a mobile phone. And she came up to me and she asked, "Are you Mr. Kara-Murza?" I said, "Yes, yes, I am, ma'am." And she said, "I'm a diplomat with the American Embassy in Ankara." She handed me the phone and said, "The President of the United States is on the line waiting to speak with you." And at that moment, I thought, I'm just going to give up trying to understand what is happening here. So I took the phone. I heard President Biden's voice. I tried to put something together to say to him. I hadn't used the word of spoken English for 2.5 years. Hadn't used much Russian either because I was in constant solitary confinement. But I put something together to say to thank him, because by then it had been explained to us who was behind this exchange. And then he passed the phone to my wife and children who were with him in the Oval Office. Now, when I was in prison, I was not allowed to speak to my family. This is the old Soviet-era tradition, where the government seeks to punish not just the political opponent, but the family as well. I was not allowed to call my wife. I was not allowed to call my kids. And standing there in the middle of that reception hall at Ankara Airport, hearing the voices of my wife and children on the cell phone, I do not think I'll be able to find the right words in any of the languages I speak to describe what that felt like. As I speak here with you tonight, more than 1,900 political prisoners remain in the Russian Gulag. People who committed no crime, who broke no law, who are only, quote unquote, guilty of having the conscience to distinguish right from wrong and having the courage to say it out loud. At least 48 of them are journalists. Putin's Russia holds the dubious distinction of being in second place globally, only after communist China, in the number of journalists held behind bars. Here are just a few names, just a small sampling of journalists imprisoned for honest reporting in a country where honest reporting is considered a crime. Ivan Safronov, former journalist with Kommersant newspaper, who revealed the sales of Russian Su-35 fighter jets to Egypt, causing an international diplomatic outcry. Maria Ponomarenko and Sergei Mikhailov, who published information about war crimes being committed by the Russian army in Ukraine. Artyom Krieger and Antonina Favorskaya, who were accused of cooperating with Alexei Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, a peaceful opposition movement that Putin's government had declared first an undesirable, then an extremist, and finally a terrorist organization. and many, many, many others who were punished simply for speaking the truth. We must not rest until they and all the other political prisoners in Russia are free, are home, and are reunited with their families. Thank you very much for your invitation. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Well, that was absolutely a heart-stopping speech about the reality of life in Russia under Putin. Thank you, Vladimir. I'm now going to invite people to come for questions. Vladimir's going to take you all in turn, but please line up on the sides of the walls where there should be a microphone for you and ask your questions. I'm going to leave the stage again, but thank you, Vladimir.
Thank you so much. Please, go ahead. I hope these are on.
My parents immigrated during the second wave of immigration, and there have been several waves since then. With each wave, is the remaining population even more indifferent or approving of the regime? What will it take for the people who carry out Putin's orders to say to themselves, I'm not going to do this anymore? In other words, it's not just him at the top, it's the people carrying out the orders. What will it take to turn things around?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this question. For 26 years, the Putin propaganda machine, which is really effective and really professional, we have to speak the truth, right? It's wrong to underestimate enemies. For all this time in power, they've created this facade, this image, that, of course, something I used to hear every day on the little radio that was attached to the wall of my prison cell, but something that I was also shocked in the year and a half that I've been out of prison to hear from many Western analysts and Western policymakers who are essentially accepting the Kremlin propaganda narrative that most people in Russia support Putin and support the war in Ukraine. I've always believed that actions speak louder than words. And the horrendous, mind-boggling statistics of political repression in Russia, which just one fact, a shocking and sobering fact, that today's Russia alone holds more political prisoners than the whole of the Soviet Union, that's 15 different countries put together, did in the mid-1980s. And every single day, this is according to Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organization, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, every single day, on average, 5 people in Russia are targeted with various forms of political repression. Very simple and logical question. If the regime really did have the support it claims to have, why would they feel the need to keep society in a state of constant fear, which they have been doing for 26 years, but especially for these last 4? Now, it is, of course, totally impossible to assess with any degree of objectivity the state of public opinion in a country that imprisons you for expressing your opinions. But we do from time to time get glimpses, what I like to call glimpses, into reality, glimpses into how a lot of people in Russia today actually feel about Putin and about his war. And one of the most vivid glimpses came actually about 2 years ago, at the beginning of 2024. Russia was in the midst of a so-called presidential election campaign where you had Putin and a couple of pre-approved clowns alongside him on the ballot imitating competition. And suddenly there was a guy, a lawyer, a former member of parliament named Boris Nadezhdin, who stepped forward and said that he was going to run for president of Russia as the anti-war candidate. And the public response was simply incredible. Suddenly, all over the country, large cities, small towns, there were hours-long lines of people who formed outside this guy's campaign offices, people who were waiting to sign the ballot petitions to get him registered as a candidate, because by Russian law you need a certain number of signatures to be on the ballot. 100,000 signatures to be precise. He had no money. He had no media access. He had no administrative support of any kind, to state the obvious. Within 2 weeks, he had 250,000 signatures, and they had to stop because they could no longer process all these ballot petitions. And of course, when I say signatures, I don't mean people just sign. You have to put your name, your home address, your passport number, all your personal information, by definition, to the state. Now, needless to say, he was not allowed on the ballot. Opposition candidates in Putin's Russia never are. But that was almost besides the point, to speak the truth, because suddenly everyone saw through this lie that is peddled by the Putin propaganda machine that everybody in Russia supports the war, everybody in Russia supports the regime. Because, they can rig election results, which they do. They can fix opinion poll numbers, which they also do. But there was nothing they could do to hide the sight of those hundreds of thousands of people who waited for hours in the middle of a Russian winter to literally vote with their feet for the sole anti-war candidate. That was a very important moment of truth, that moment with Nadezhdin 2 years ago. And so I think it is very important to remember that the propaganda facade that is being built by Vladimir Putin has very little in common with the actual reality. Now, it is absolutely true, to the point of your question, that there are also, just as there are hundreds of thousands of people who supported the anti-war candidate, there are also tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people who are following these criminal orders, as you said, and who are personally responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. And it is my position, and I know it is shared by many of my colleagues in the Russian democratic movement, that when the regime changes, every single one of these people has to be brought to account. This is something that never happened in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet regime. And to me, this is the problem. Because back in the early 90s, Russia's democratic government at the time made a conscious decision to just forget and move on. There were no trials of any kind. There were no illustrations. There were no Truth and Reconciliations commissions. There were no openings of the archives. The KGB was only renamed as opposed to disbanded. People thought, okay, this is over. Let's just forget about it and let's go forward. Never works this way, because we know from the experience of any country that successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy that transitional justice is key to this process. You cannot just move on from decades of totalitarian trauma unless you address it, and unless you process it, and unless these crimes are accounted for and reflected on, and the ideologies and practices of the old regime are fully condemned on a state level to make sure they never return again. This never happened in the 90s, and as a result, we have a KGB officer in power. This will need to happen following the downfall of the Putin regime. And every single one of these people who followed these criminal orders that you referenced, in Ukraine, in Syria, in the Republic of Georgia, in Chechnya, against our own Russian citizens, with all the opposition leaders and journalists who were killed, each and every one of these people will have to be brought to account. Because that is the only way our country will ever have a normal, civilized, democratic future, if all these crimes are accounted for and all the people who committed them are punished. Thank you so much for your question.
Mr. Kara-Murza, thank you very much for coming. A very inspirational story, a very strong story. I think everybody would agree with me here. I've had one question. It's more of your life inside the prison. What moment during your imprisonment affected you the most, and why? Was it something psychological? Was there a psychological hurdle there, or was it the way maybe you were treated by the guards, right? If you can explore that aspect too, I think everybody would be interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Well, one of the sort of biggest revelations for me after this experience, because, I'd never been to prison before. I just read about it in books and so on, although I had the honor of knowing many of the Soviet dissidents in person, people like Bukovsky and Sharansky and Yuri Orlov, people who went through this experience decades ago. But you can never know or feel something until you experience it personally, right? It's not the same to read in books. But one of my biggest revelations was that the prison world, the people in prison, are essentially, very reflective of the bigger world, of the outside world, of the population at large. I sort of went in there with that idea that most people I would find there, and I'm talking about the people who work there, the administration, the guards, and so on, would be some sort of monsters, sadists. And of course, there are people like this. But I would say there are probably no more in terms of share than among the general population, where there are also sadists and monsters who walk daily around us. On the other extreme, there were people who were good people, even inside that system, who tried to help quietly. And I never say their names for obvious reasons. Back in the 19th century, a prominent Russian writer called Vladimir Kara-Murza wrote a book about the political prisoners of that time. This was the time of the Russian Empire, late 19th, early 20th century. And he had a chapter about a prison official who tried to be kind to political prisoners and who tried to help them in any way he could. And the title of that chapter is A Good Man in a Bad Place. And I was able to see personally that there are still good people in those very bad places. Not a lot, also a very small percentage, just like the sadists and the monsters. And the vast majority of people who work in the prison system are just ordinary, regular people who turn up at work at 9 o'clock in the morning. But that is how most dictatorships operate, when people do not ask questions and just do what they are told to do, and are just quote-unquote carrying orders. So that was a big experience for me. And I hope one day I'm able to talk more about the people who tried to help. For now, for obvious reasons, I cannot do that. But if you want to ask about a specific moment, first of all, when you're in solitary confinement, the line between reality and fiction is very blurry. Right? There's a reason that, according to international law, this is in the United Nations standard minimal rules for the treatment of prisoners, better known as the Nelson Mandela rules. There's a provision that more than 15 days in solitary confinement is considered torture. I was in solitary for a year straight with no breaks, and I never understood. I mean, I'd known this rule for a long time, but I'd never really understood it. I didn't understand what's torturous about it. Well, I certainly do now. And I also get where the 15 days come from, because after actually about 2 weeks of total deprivation of human contact, when you just sit in that tiny cell all day long, day after day, week after week, you start going crazy. Aristotle once wrote that we human beings are social animals, right? We need human contact, interaction with other humans, no less than we need water to drink or oxygen to breathe. And when a human being is just totally deprived of any contact with fellow humans, they start losing their mind. And it takes a special effort not to. You know, you start to forget names, you start to forget words, you start shouting at walls, you stop understanding the difference between what is real and what's imagined, and you need a special strength to maintain your sanity. Now, as I mentioned, I was fortunate that I had known so many of these Soviet dissidents. I'd read all their books, for example, To Build a Castle by Vladimir Bukovsky. And so although one can never really feel it personally, at least I had the learned knowledge and the learned experience of what these people did back then, but because they were also all held in solitary confinement. This is a long tradition in our country. I knew what they had done not to go crazy. And the key here in all cases, you have to occupy your mind with something practical and something constructive, right? You have to channel your mental energy into something so you just don't wallow in this constant recurring cycles of thoughts and memories. And each and every one of the Soviet dissidents had their own ways of coping with this, of not going crazy. If you read Vladimir Bukovsky's book, To Build a Castle, which, by the way, I recommend to anybody who's interested in 20th century Russian history, it's an amazing book, and it reads amazingly, too. And so, as the title of the book suggests, Bukovsky was building imaginary castles inside his head, just creating this parallel reality that was not controlled by his jailers. Natan Sharansky, his book, also amazing, is called Fear No Evil. He was a brilliant mathematician as well as an amazing chess player, and so what he would do, he would spend the whole time playing constant mental chess games inside his head against himself. He wrote in the book that the good news was whatever happened, he would always win. Now, contrary to many stereotypes you may have heard about Russians, I'm hopeless in maths and in chess. But I also did not want to go crazy. So what I managed to do was to get a hold of a Spanish textbook, a university coursework in Spanish, and I was just sitting there every single day, morning till night, day after day, week after week, month after month, just learning it, just memorizing. I was not allowed to write, only an hour and a half a day. They'd bring the pen and paper, then I'd take it away again. But I could have the book, one book in a punishment cell. And I was just reading, learning, memorizing verb tenses and vocabulary and what have you. I never hoped I'd be able to use any of that Spanish, of course, but not going crazy was a strong enough incentive to continue doing it every single day, day after day, day after day, day after day. I never hoped I'd ever be able to use any of that Spanish, but I thought in the worst case scenario, if I did end up going crazy, I'd be able to shout at my walls and at my prison guards in an authentic Castilian dialect. What do you know? A few months ago, my wife and I were in Spain for meetings in Madrid with the members of the Spanish Parliament, and it turned out almost none of them speak English. So I actually had to go and use my prison Spanish for our conversation. So there's something useful and practical you can do even in the worst circumstances. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you.
Hi. So my question is more so towards the politician side of what you do. What do you take as your example for a path forward for reform in Russia? The reason I ask this is I used to, years ago, hope that something like Maidan could be replicated. But seeing the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of mass protest movements like Bolotny, it seems difficult to take Russia's neighbors as comparisons. So what do you think needs to happen in Russia for it to be ready for reform of that sort?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Of course, we did have a popular revolution back in August of 1991 when people literally just went into the streets, unarmed people in hundreds of thousands, and stood in front of those tanks that the coup leaders had sent into Moscow, and they proved stronger. And you mentioned the Bolotny protest. To me, that was a real chance, the winter of 2011, 2012. It was a moment when the regime was afraid for its existence, and you could physically read fear in these riot police officers who were told to go and create security perimeters around these demonstrations. But they'd never seen demonstrations as large as that, because most of them were too young to remember 91. And these were the biggest protests in Russia in 20 years since the Democratic Revolution. And I think the fatal mistake of those protests was to take a Christmas holiday. Revolutions do not take holidays. And when we had the biggest demonstration on Andrei Sakharov Avenue, this was on December the 24th, 2011, more than 120,000 people. Moscow hadn't seen anything like this since 1991. Anything was possible. The air was electrified. Everything was possible. And then most opposition leaders just took a long Christmas and New Year break. And by the time they returned, the momentum was lost. The regime had time to regroup. The regime had time to go on a counteroffensive. So to me, we could talk about this for a long time. To me, those winter protests were a big missed opportunity. To your question, what would it take? First of all, I'm not just a politician, I'm also a historian by education. And one thing we definitely know from the modern history of Russia is that major political changes in our country usually happen like this, swiftly, suddenly, and completely unexpectedly. Unexpectedly even for their own participants. I'm not a big fan of Lenin, as you can probably gather from my biography, and I don't really read or quote his speeches, but there is one speech of his that I do like to quote from. It was a speech he gave to the young social democrats of Switzerland in Zurich, which he ended by saying, "We old folks will not live to see the decisive battles of the coming revolution." That speech was given on January 22nd, 1917. The revolution began in 6 weeks. This is Russia. Things are sudden and unpredictable. I could stand here and give you 100 detailed scenarios of how political change in Russia can come, and it's going to be 101st that none of us think of. So to me, the main question is whether or not we will be ready when that moment comes. And to me, this is the biggest responsibility of the democratic movement in Russia now, to be ready. Because the big problem, both in 1917 and in 1991, was that these regimes, these dictatorships, the imperial regime and then the communist regime collapsed so suddenly and so unexpectedly for people that there was no ready program, there was no roadmap, there was no plan, there was nothing. And that's why so many mistakes were made. And what I was saying in response to the lady's question about the absence of any kind of accountability or transitional justice after the collapse of communism, that was also to a big extent because of that, because it was so sudden and unexpected. There's a really good book that was published a couple of months ago at the University of Berkeley, California. It's a book by a well-known Russian anthropologist, Alexei Yurchak, who writes about the later years of the Soviet regime, so the late 1980s. And the title of the book is, "It Was Forever Until It Was No More." That is exactly how it happened. I remember that myself, and that's exactly how it will happen next time. It could be in 5 years and could be next week, but we have to be ready because we do not have the right, and this is why I talk so much, for example, about transitional justice and the need for accountability, because when that moment comes, it'll be too late to sit down and start thinking, okay, what do we do now? The time to think is now, so that we do have that action plan ready for the day after Putin. I'm part of this project, very important project, led by Memorial, whom I already mentioned, Russia's most respected human rights organization. And the project is called 100 Days After Putin. And they bring together people from different fields, different walks of life. They have election experts, they have constitutional law specialists, they have lawyers who work on transitional justice, they have diplomats and so on, people from all different fields, to draw up that roadmap for what will need to be done the moment this regime is gone. I wrote a foreword for it. It's actually coming out in book form in a few weeks' time. And to me, this is the most important thing that needs to be done right now, not just by us in the Russian opposition, but also by people in the West. Because the mistake, if we're honest about this, the mistakes in the 1990s were made on both sides. The West messed up quite a lot too, also because it was unprepared, because the Soviet Union was forever until it was no more. And so we have to use the time that we have, and none of us knows how much time. Again, could be 5 years, could be next week, but we have to use the time we have to make sure that when that moment comes, when the Putin regime is gone, we have that roadmap and we know what needs to be done. To make sure that our kids and grandkids do not have to deal with another small p Putin 20 or 30 years down the line. Thank you so much. Thanks for the question. Let's go to that side.
So my question for you is, when you were brought into the office and they asked you to essentially rewrite the letter that they had written for you, where you say, "Oh, I'm guilty. I'm, like basically everything that you were not," and you decided to write your criticisms. Were you not afraid in that moment that they were going to double down on their punishment of you? Was it because you were already like you said, like almost to life? So were you just, it can't get much worse than this, other than maybe they execute me?
Actually, sort of my mindset was exactly the reverse of that. These people have taken everything from me. They've taken away my life. They've taken away my work. They've taken away my family. Couldn't even speak to my wife and kids. All I had left was my dignity and my name, and they were never going to get that. That was the mindset. That's the mentality. That's the only way you can survive in prison.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hello,
Yeah,
Vladimir.
also.
I'm honored to be here. So I'd like to ask you 4 questions, if I may.
If Sarah's okay with that, she's the boss.
She's the boss. Sarah, is that okay? All right. All right. I will do that.
Okay.
How reasonable is it to really expect a peaceful transition of power in Russian Federation? All right, and I'll ask 2-part question. It is a common opinion that I keep hearing resounding across voices in that side of the woods, that the only way to stop the expansion of that empire is for it to fall apart into its individual enslaved components. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you so much. On your first question, so let me separate this. What I want to see is, of course, a peaceful transition of power. The Russian democratic movement, just like the Soviet dissident movement before it, is a non-violent movement out of principle. So this was our goal all this time. But putting my analyst hat on, I do not see how after 26 years of this, after so many wars, after so many deaths, after so many murders, after so much destruction, how they can peacefully transition out of that. I do not see this. So I say this unfortunately, but no, I do not see a chance for a peaceful transition after these guys are gone. We have to make sure, though, we use that window of opportunity when it opens, what I was talking about with regard to the previous question. We have to make sure we seize that moment, because those windows of opportunity after the collapse of a dictatorship are always short and brief, by definition. We will not have the luxury of years of sitting out and figuring what needs to be done. We'll need to act fast. That's why having a plan is so important. And on your second question, that's actually this idea of that Russia has to break apart. That's a favorite boogeyman of Kremlin propaganda. Now, when I was in prison, first in Moscow, there was a television, and in Siberia there was a radio. When I would be exposed to hearing these state so-called news bulletins and so-called talk shows from the Kremlin propaganda, this was the idea they always kept coming back to, that Putin is the only chance for Russia to stay together. As soon as these opposition guys come in, we'll all fall apart. Now, of course, it's absolute nonsense. None of us want our country to fall apart. I love my country. I want to see it freed from a murderous, repressive, KGB-led dictatorship. I do not want it to collapse, and you will not find any serious people in the Russian opposition who want our country to collapse. Not least because that would just be an absolute nightmare for the whole world. Just imagine, just look at the map. We're the largest country in the world, with the world's most powerful nuclear arsenal. Do we really want to see 20 different nuclear states in that territory? Yes, some of them may be democracies, but many won't. They might go to war with each other. It'll be chaos, it'll be bloodshed. Who's going to benefit from that? I mean, there's actually nobody who really wants it. It's a bogeyman that's put out by Putin's propaganda. And let's not sort of play into their hands by, even discussing it seriously. I mean, I was not surprised in the least when a few weeks ago, you may have heard the story, there was a woman who was arrested, a Russian citizen who was arrested by the FBI in this country. She's going on trial soon for having worked for the FSB, the Russian security services, and what she claimed to be was a so-called anti-colonial activist. So coming up and holding conferences on this idea that Russia should be broken apart into pieces. I was not at all surprised to find out that she was actually an FSB agent, because that's the narrative that's spread by the Kremlin. It's either Putin or Russia will fall apart. That's absolute nonsense. I want my country to be a democracy. I want it to be a parliamentary republic, right? Enough with one person holding all the power. That system's just wrong. And above all, I want it to be a true federation, or perhaps even a confederation like Canada, where you have real powers, real subsidiarity, including tax authorities and economic powers, as low as possible on this power structure, all in the regions, all in municipalities. And actually, I mentioned Canada. I think that's a very good model for us. When people say Russia's too big and Russia's too cold to be a functioning democracy, look at Canada. It's big and it's cold. Second country in the world in territory after Russia. And they're managing okay. So that's our model, and that's what we want to see after Putin is gone. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
So I know you mentioned what Western countries should do after Putin eventually goes down, but is there anything that you think that, although I know the West has done some things, especially the freeing of you and your fellow prisoners, is there anything that additionally you think both the Western governments and the Western people themselves, such as citizens and stuff like that, can do to contribute to or accelerate Putin's downfall, or do you think it should just be entirely in the hands of the Russian citizens?
Thank you so much. Now, of course, the quickest and most important response to your last point is yes, of course, only Russian citizens can change Russia. That's how it should be, and that's how it will be. And that change never comes from the outside, and it shouldn't either. What I think is important, and that actually goes to the very topic of the lecture. A lot of what we're seeing in Russia today is exactly the same as what we saw in the Soviet times, right? There's a dictatorship, there's total censorship by the state, there are political prisoners and so on. The only big difference is in the position of the West, to the point of your question. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was no question that the Western world, led by the United States of America, was firmly on the side of freedom against tyranny. And to me, one of the most important factors leading to the eventual downfall of the communist regime, not just in the Soviet Union, but across Central and Eastern Europe, was the fact that this informational Iron Curtain had been broken, had been breached. For example, by all these Western radio stations that would broadcast across the Iron Curtain, with their short-wave radio signals to reach literally millions of people inside the communist bloc in their own languages, with truthful information, in Russian, in Ukrainian, in Latvian, and Polish, and all the other languages of the enslaved nations. There was an internal KGB report in the 1970s that was declassified after 1991 that showed that, according to their own estimates from the Soviet KGB, up to 30 million people in the Soviet Union, that's not counting other countries, only the Soviet Union, were regular, meaning daily or weekly listeners of these foreign radio broadcasts. That's 15% of the adult population on average, and in big cities, the proportion was much higher. And to me, this was one of the most important reasons for the collapse of the regimes, the fact that these regimes had become delegitimized in the eyes of a significant part of their own population, especially in the large cities, which always drive political change. And Vladimir Bukovsky, whom I mentioned several times, a legendary Russian dissident, once said that he sees a direct correlation between those teenagers who were listening to Radio Free Europe or Voice of America or Deutsche Welle or the BBC and so on in the mid-1970s, and those 30-somethings who went to the streets in August 1991 to stand in front of the tanks and who heralded the Russian Democratic Revolution, these were the same people. Now, this is not where Western policy is today, I'm very sorry to say. I mentioned the Voice of America. It does not exist anymore. And destroyed not by some foreign dictatorship, but by the government of the United States in a concerted drive last year. And we're seeing very often Western big tech companies behaving no better than Western governments. Just one example, a lot of us have iPhones in our pockets. Apple, an American company, the course of 2024, took down apps belonging to independent media outlets like the BBC, like Medusa, like The Insider, like many, many others. And more than 50 VPN services that allowed Russian users to overcome official censorship and access independent news websites. Apple removed more than 50 VPN services from its Russian App Store because Mr. Putin had asked them to. And for this American company, very obviously, getting money and doing business in Putin's Russia is more important than upholding the principle of freedom of speech. And there are many, I don't want to single out Apple, that's just the best known example. There are many similar examples. And so while absolutely only Russian citizens can and should change their own country, it would be nice to see the free world not helping the dictatorship. And this is unfortunately what they're doing today. So thank you for your question.
Yep, thank you.
Good evening. So during your time in solitary confinement, you were given access to a pen and paper for less than 2 hours a day. Already being certain that you would die in that prison, what helped you retain that conviction to hold on to the bits and stories of pieces that you would end up writing?
Thank you so much. Yes, that was the daily schedule when I was in Siberian solitary confinement. They only gave you pen and paper for an hour and a half. So the guards would bring it in, and everything I was planning to do in a given day, prepare for court hearings, read through legal documents, take notes from books, read letters, respond to letters, all of that had to be squeezed into that hour and a half. Then they would take the pen and paper away again. So that was a whole separate kind of torture because I liked writing, and it was so much that, there was all the time in the world, you couldn't do anything, right? So at least I had that Spanish textbook with me. But you're asking what helped me sustain myself. I would probably say three things. Number one is my Christian faith. That was very important to me because I knew that, every minute of every day I spent in that Siberian prison, I was really not alone. They may have thought I was, but I really wasn't, and I knew that somebody out there was looking out for me, and that was important. Number two, I would say my education as a historian actually was really useful in prison, perhaps more useful than at any point in my previous life, because none of this is new. All of this stuff has happened before. And if we look at the history of Russia over the past 3 centuries or more, you'll see this constant alternation between repression, reform, repression, reform, repression, reform. I mean, that's why we, keep spending so much time on the preparation, because we want to get out of that vicious cycle, right? To make sure we don't go into this recurring cycle again. But the fact that this dictatorship will fall and that there will be a thaw after this, there will be a period of reform, that's not under discussion. We know it because that's how it's been every time for the last 3 centuries. Why would it be different now? So that actually really helped me sustain myself because I knew that this is not forever. Or this may seem forever, but then it will be no more. And finally, I would say, many years ago, 20 years ago now, more than 20 years ago, I made a documentary film about the Soviet dissident movement. It was called They Chose Freedom. And your university library actually now has a copy of this. Thank you. And one of the people I interviewed for the film was Vladimir Bukovsky, who I mentioned many times in this lecture, somebody who was very important in my life. And I asked him, what made you go through all this? How did you survive? How did you stay sane? How did you withstand all of this hell that you were subjected to? And I guess I was expecting some sort of a long, detailed response. And he just looked at me and he said, I knew that I was right. And I'm not sure I understood those words at the time. I put that in the film because it just sounds really good. So that's how my second episode ends. But I'm not sure I understood it. I certainly do now. That knowledge that you are right, whatever happens outside, is really, really important. For the entirety of my time in that Siberian prison, I knew that I was not the criminal. They are. The people who started this war, the people who are killing kids in Ukraine every day, they're the criminals, not me. And I knew this every second of the time that I spent there. And that knowledge, that understanding that you are right is really, really important. Because when you know that you're right, the fear and the doubt just go away. Thank you so much for this question. Please.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for sharing your experience. It's very important that you're doing so. My question is, what do you think is usually the biggest factor in someone like Vladimir Putin, like rising to power, like before they actually have the power? What do you think? Like, just what do you think, I guess, is the biggest influence on them rising to power?
Well, in our particular case, I would say it was the fact that there was never any atonement, there was never any accountability for the crimes of the Soviet regime. Remember, Putin was a Soviet KGB officer. He started out in the 1970s under Andropov as head of the KGB. He was personally participating in the searches, arrests, and interrogations of dissidents in Leningrad in the 1970s. If you look at the experience of most other former communist bloc countries, Czech Republic, Poland, Baltic states, Romania, you will see that in each of these countries, there were different processes. They were not without criticism, certainly. I'm not saying they had it perfect. No, they didn't. But in most of these countries, there was some sort of a vetting process, some sort of illustration process, like in the Czech Republic and Poland, where you had a very clear principle that people who had personally participated in the crimes of the old regime would not be allowed to come anywhere near positions of power again. This is how it was done in many of these former communist countries. And this was what people like Bukovsky wanted and demanded and shouted about in the early 1990s. It's not, that we are standing here in the year 2026 so clever looking back. No, there were people at the time who were arguing for these things, saying that we need this. Otherwise, this democratic experiment is going to collapse if all these people are left there. And in 1992, Galina Starovoitova, she was a member of parliament from St. Petersburg, one of the leaders of the democratic Russia movement. She introduced into the Russian parliament a draft law on lustrations that was modeled on a law already by then adopted in what was then still Czechoslovakia. And according to this law, or draft law that she proposed, all those people who had held senior positions in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, both at the national and the regional level, and who are employees, officers, operatives, or agents of the Soviet KGB, would be banned from any positions of executive authority. Now, if that law had been passed, this was 1992, Vladimir Putin would not have been able to even become deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, let alone prime minister or president of Russia. But it was not even debated. Because at that time, people were just callous about it. They thought, okay, this is all over, let's just forget about this as a nightmare and move on. And again, it does not work this way. And I think it was actually very symbolic that one of Putin's first acts as president of Russia was to reinstate the old Soviet national anthem that had been personally picked by Joseph Stalin. This was in the year 2000. There's this myth that the early Putin was okay, that he was better. No. He was Putin from the very beginning. He brought back the Stalin national anthem in the year 2000, 26 years ago. So in our case, I think the lesson is very clear, that if evil is not publicly reflected on, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, as it should have been then, it's going to come back, as it did when Putin came to power. When Bukovsky was arguing for all these measures back in 1991, 92, 93, he would very often get, government officials, Russian government officials, just, shrugging at him and saying, no, this is a witch hunt. What you're calling for is a witch hunt. To which he responded, in that case, the witches will come back and start hunting us. And this was exactly what happened when a Soviet KGB officer became president of Russia and continues to be in the Kremlin 26 years on. So we learned that lesson a very hard way, although it was possible in the early 90s to actually look at what other countries were doing. But now, once this regime is gone, nobody will ever be able to say, oh, let's just forget about it and move on, because we know what happens when we do.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. You're the boss. Sarah, I already said this a few times.
All right, thanks. I lucked out then. Thank you so much. I think, to me, you're this really amazing example of bravery, especially in the current time in the U.S. And you've already mentioned about political suppression in the U.S. and also the role of big tech in that. And I was wondering if you have any advice for us as young people in the U.S. What are your recommendations for not continuing on a path to dictatorship here?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I do not presume to offer anybody any advice, but I can just speak to the experience that we had in Russia under Putin. And the way Putin destroyed democracy in Russia was really clever. Again, it's a mistake to underestimate our enemies. He was really clever about it. He didn't try to do it all at once. He did it gradually. He did it carefully. He did it incrementally, step by step. Mussolini once said, when he was talking about his own consolidation of power in Italy in the 1920s, he said that he had done this in a manner of, and I quote, plucking the chicken feather by feather to lessen the squawking. And of course, that's how he did this. And that's exactly how Putin did this, starting with the media, television channels, then going after opposition parties and throwing them out of parliament, then arresting his opponents, and so on. And by the time Russian society finally woke up to what was actually happening here, there was almost nothing left to defend, because he'd already consolidated his rule in the way that he continues to hold it today. And so, again, not advice, but just a lesson from our experience. I think it is very important to watch out for those early warning signs and to do everything that you can as concerned citizens, as voters, as citizens of your country, to make sure the situation does not get to the point when there's nothing left to defend. I very much like this phrase. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but it sounds good. 1787, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and when Ben Franklin walked out, a lady came up to him in the street and she asked, what kind of a government did you give us, sir? A republic or a monarchy? And he said to her, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And I think it's very important to remember that democracies do not just stay there automatically. They depend on active citizenry who will not allow these democracies to fall, and who will do everything that they can to keep it. Thank you for your question.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful speech. I'm from Georgia, from Republic of Georgia, and I'm interested in Russia's population attitude towards the 2008 invasion of Russia, and your opinion about current situation in Georgia. Do you know about Mzyama Globeli, who is a journalist, who is imprisoned by government of Georgia, and what's your advice to us, to the population of Georgia?
Well, of course, per capita, Georgia now has the highest number of political prisoners in any of the former Soviet republics, per capita, not in absolute numbers, but it's a very small country. And there are more political prisoners per residence than in Russia, than in Belarus, than in Central Asian countries even. And yes, of course, I know not only her, but many other journalists and opposition politicians who are imprisoned in Georgia. Actually, in fact, when I was in prison, we used to correspond with Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia, who is now a political prisoner. He would write to me, I would write to him. We were pen pals, and I very much hope to see the day very soon when we're able to just chat over a glass of wine as opposed to write each other on prison paper. But it's absolutely tragic what's happening in Georgia, and my heart and my support, my solidarity goes to all those brave people who continue these protests on Rustaveli Street now for almost a full year going with no stop. And far from offering any advice, I'm just taking my hat off and I'm saying how much I respect and admire our Georgian colleagues and Georgian friends who are not allowing, to the conversation we had here before, who are not allowing these horrible guys, these crooks, to destroy your democracy without a fight. And I have no doubt in the end, democratic Georgia will prevail. I remember actually that's one of the things we would discuss by letters with President Saakashvili, that one day both of our countries will be free. And it's going to be a good chain reaction. Right now it's a bad chain reaction with Putin spreading this cancer of authoritarianism around to the post-Soviet states, including Georgia. One day will turn us our way, and there'll be a good chain reaction of the spread of freedom. I've done your question about the invasion in 2008. Let's not forget this was the first time that Vladimir Putin crossed the border of another sovereign state. There were many war crimes in Chechnya, horrendous war crimes, but Chechnya is part of Russian territory. Georgia was a sovereign, independent state. And in August of 2008, he crossed an international border for the first time. And what was the response by the international community? Nothing. Sarkozy came waving some piece of paper like Chamberlain in 1938. President Obama in the US pushed a reset button, and everything was fine, everything was forgotten. And if you, Putin, what lesson do you take? It's okay, they don't care. And so he then went for Crimea. And again, almost nothing happened. Some cosmetic, little sanctions here or there. And back to business as usual very soon. And then he thought, okay, if I can do all this, why don't I just try for Ukraine as a whole? And so we're now in the 5th year of the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And so, I think one of the lessons of these 26 years of Russia's journey away from democracy to dictatorship is that the free world actually bears a lot of responsibility for allowing Putin's regime to become a monster that it has become today. And so when that post-Putin Russia comes, it will also be our joint responsibility, both us as Russian citizens, but also the free world, to make sure that our next democratic experiment is successful and that Russia finally becomes a country that will respect the rights and freedoms of its own people and that will respect the borders of all its neighbors, including Ukraine, including Georgia, that will all have to regain their lawful territories according to the borders of 1991. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vladimir Kara-Murza, for a fascinating talk. Thank you all for coming and being a wonderful audience tonight. Have a good evening.